Picture this, February 13th, 1258. The Tigris River, which has flowed through Mesopotamia for thousands of years, carrying the life-giving waters that made civilization possible in this ancient land, is running black, not from mud, not from silt, from ink, the ink of hundreds of thousands of books being thrown into its waters. And it's also running red. Red from the blood of hundreds of thousands of people being massacred in the streets of what was, just days before, the greatest city in the world. This is the story of how in just 13 days, a catastrophe unfolded that would change the course of human history. The story of how the most advanced civilization on earth was brought to its knees. The story of how centuries of accumulated knowledge, wisdom, and scientific advancement were destroyed in an orgy of violence so complete, so total, that the shock waves are still felt today, over 750 years later. Welcome to the story of the Mongol sack of Baghdad, the day the Islamic Golden Age died, the day the lights went out on the medieval world's greatest center of learning, and an intellectual darkness descended that would last for centuries. This is not just about one city falling to invaders. This has happened countless times throughout history. This is about what happened when unstoppable force met immovable object, when the most feared military machine ever created met the wealthiest, most sophisticated civilization of its time, when nomadic warriors from the steppes of Asia came face to face with the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why many historians consider February 13th, 1258 to be one of the bloodiest days in all of human history. You'll see how a single siege ended an age of unprecedented scientific discovery and cultural achievement. And you'll discover how the destruction of one city rippled outward to reshape the entire world in ways we're still dealing with today. This is a story about hubris and destruction, about knowledge and ignorance, about civilization and barbarism. So let's go back to 1258 and witness the end of an empire that had stood for 5 centuries. To understand what was destroyed, we first need to understand what Baghdad was in the year 1258. Because if you asked anyone in the medieval world which city was the center of human civilization, the answer would be obvious. Baghdad, not Paris, not London, not Rome, Baghdad, and it wasn't even close. Let me paint you a picture of this magnificent city in the decades and centuries before the Mongols arrived, because this wasn't just any city. This was the crown jewel of human achievement. Founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad was deliberately designed as a circular city, with massive walls and gates arranged in a perfect circle. The Caliph's palace and the Grand Mosque stood at the very center, the heart from which power and knowledge radiated outward. The city sat at the crossroads of the world, positioned perfectly between east and west, with the Tigris River providing a natural highway for trade goods from 3 continents. By the 9th and 10th centuries, during the reign of caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, Baghdad had become the largest city in the world outside of China. Estimates vary, but at its peak, Baghdad likely had a population somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. That's staggering for the medieval period. For comparison, London in the 13th century had maybe 50,000 people. Paris perhaps 100,000. Baghdad dwarfed them all. But it wasn't the size that made Baghdad special. It was what happened inside those circular walls. Baghdad was insanely wealthy. Trade caravans arrived daily from India bringing spices, gems, and silks. Ships sailed up the Persian Gulf from Africa with ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The famous Silk Road brought Chinese porcelain, paper, and gunpowder. All of this wealth flowed through Baghdad, and the Abbasid caliphs took their cut. The city's markets were legendary. One 10th century geographer described walking through the bazaars and seeing goods from literally every corner of the known world. Things that Europeans had never heard of were common in Baghdad's markets. The wealth was almost unimaginable. But here's what made Baghdad truly special, what elevated it beyond just another wealthy trading hub. Knowledge, learning, science, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. In an age when most of Europe was struggling through what we call the Dark Ages, When literacy rates were abysmal and scientific progress had ground to a halt, Baghdad was experiencing an intellectual renaissance that would shape the future of human civilization. This period from roughly the 8th to the 13th century is called the Islamic Golden Age, and Baghdad was its shining capital. Let me tell you about the House of Wisdom, known in Arabic as Bayt al-Hikmah, because this institution alone represents everything that was about to be destroyed. The House of Wisdom was established by Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the late 8th century and then massively expanded by his son al-Mamun in the early 9th century. Think of it as a combination of the Library of Alexandria, a modern research university, and a translation academy, all rolled into one magnificent institution. This wasn't just a library where books sat on shelves gathering dust. This was an active, vibrant center of scholarship where the greatest minds of the age worked every single day advancing human knowledge. The House of Wisdom had a massive library filled with manuscripts collected from across the known world. Scholars estimate it contained hundreds of thousands of books, possibly as many as 400,000 manuscripts. These weren't modern, mass-produced books. Each one was handwritten, hand-illustrated, irreplaceable. They contained works from ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and China. Philosophy texts from Aristotle and Plato that had been lost to Western Europe. Mathematical treatises from India introducing the concept of zero and the decimal system. Astronomical observations from Persia. Medical knowledge from China. All of it gathered, all of it preserved, all of it being studied and built upon by Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars working side by side. The translation movement at the House of Wisdom was extraordinary. Teams of scholars were paid generous salaries to translate works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, Syriac, and other languages into Arabic. According to some accounts, Caliph al-Mamun was so passionate about acquiring knowledge that he would pay translators the weight of each translated book in gold. Imagine that, the weight of a book in gold. That tells you how much knowledge was valued in Baghdad. Christian scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq led translation teams that rendered Galen's medical texts, Ptolemy's astronomical works, and Euclid's geometry into Arabic, often improving and correcting errors in the original texts as they went. But the House of Wisdom wasn't just about preserving old knowledge. It was about creating new knowledge. This is where algebra as we know it was invented. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, working at the House of Wisdom in the 9th century, wrote Kitab al-Jabr wa al-Muqabala, the book from which the word algebra derives. Al-Khwarizmi also gave us the word algorithm, derived from his own name. He introduced the Hindu-Arabic numeral system to the Islamic world, including that revolutionary concept of zero, which would eventually make its way to Europe and replace the cumbersome Roman numerals that had hobbled mathematical progress for centuries. Think about trying to do complex math with Roman numerals. It's nearly impossible. The decimal system changed everything. At the House of Wisdom, astronomers built observatories and mapped the heavens with unprecedented accuracy. They calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few percentage points of the correct value, over 700 years before European explorers proved the Earth was round. They discovered that the Earth rotates on its axis. They challenged Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe. They created star charts that navigators would use for centuries. They invented instruments like improved astrolabes and celestial globes that allowed sailors to navigate across vast oceans. In medicine, scholars at Baghdad's hospitals and medical schools advanced the field in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 500 years. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, was the first to distinguish between smallpox and measles, providing detailed clinical descriptions of both diseases. He wrote over 200 medical works and pioneered the use of animal gut for sutures, alcohol for sterilization, and plaster for setting broken bones. Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, an encyclopedia that synthesized all known medical knowledge of the time. This book was so comprehensive, so advanced, that it remained the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 1650s. Let that sink in. a medical text written in Baghdad in the 11th century, was still being used to train doctors in Paris and London 600 years later. Baghdad scholars revolutionized chemistry and alchemy. Jabir ibn Hayyan developed laboratory techniques like crystallization, distillation, and sublimation that are still used today. He discovered sulfuric acid and nitric acid, foundational to all modern chemistry. The word alkali comes from Arabic. So does alcohol, so does elixir. The very language of chemistry is rooted in the work done in Baghdad. In physics and optics, Ibn al-Haytham, known as Alhazen, revolutionized our understanding of light and vision. His book of optics, written around 1021, was the first to correctly explain that we see objects because light enters our eyes from those objects, not because our eyes send out rays as the ancient Greeks had believed. He developed the scientific method, conducting controlled experiments to test hypotheses, documenting procedures so others could replicate them, drawing conclusions based on evidence rather than philosophical speculation. Roger Bacon and other European scholars of the Renaissance built directly on Ibn al-Haytham's work when they developed modern experimental science. Philosophy flourished in Baghdad and across the Islamic world. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Averroes, and others wrestled with questions of existence, knowledge, ethics, and the nature of reality. They preserved and commented on Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, at a time when Europe had lost access to these works. When Thomas Aquinas and other medieval European theologians wanted to read Aristotle in the 13th century, they read Latin translations of Arabic commentaries written by Muslim philosophers. The Islamic world literally transmitted Greek philosophy back to the West. The people of Baghdad lived extraordinarily well compared to the rest of the medieval world. The city had advanced plumbing and sewage systems. Public baths were everywhere, promoting hygiene in an age when most Europeans bathed maybe once or twice a year. The city had paved streets and street lighting fueled by oil lamps. There were hospitals that provided free health care to the poor. There were numerous madrasas, which were educational institutions where students could study law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Education was highly valued, and literacy rates in Baghdad were far higher than in medieval European cities. The city had 36 public libraries. Think about that. 36 libraries in one medieval city. Most European cities didn't have a single library. Books were precious, rare, and mostly locked away in monasteries where only monks could read them. But in Baghdad, libraries were public institutions where scholars from any background, any religion, could come to study and learn. Jewish scholars studied alongside Muslim scholars, studied alongside Christian scholars. This was a cosmopolitan, pluralistic society that valued knowledge over dogma, inquiry over orthodoxy, progress over tradition. Baghdad was also a city of stunning beauty. The caliphs built magnificent palaces with elaborate gardens, fountains, and pools. The Abbasid palaces were said to have mechanical devices that amazed visitors, including an automated throne that could be raised to the ceiling, mechanical lions that roared, and artificial trees with mechanical singing birds. Whether all these stories are exaggerated or not, they speak to a culture that valued innovation, engineering, and the impressive application of scientific principles. The markets were filled with goods no European could imagine. Paper was common in Baghdad, manufactured at paper mills using techniques learned from the Chinese while Europe was still using expensive parchment made from animal skins. This abundance of cheap paper meant books could be produced more easily, further accelerating the spread of knowledge. Glassware of exquisite quality was manufactured, textiles with intricate patterns, carpets that are still considered masterpieces today, metalwork inlaid with silver and gold in geometric patterns of breathtaking complexity. This was a culture at the absolute peak of artistic and technical achievement. Now here's the tragic irony. By 1258, when the Mongols arrived, Baghdad's golden age was technically already over. Political power had fragmented. The Abbasid caliphs, who had once ruled an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia, had been reduced to figurehead rulers who controlled little beyond Baghdad itself. Real power had passed to various Turkish and Persian dynasties who ruled in the caliph's name but did as they pleased. The city was still wealthy, still a center of trade and learning, But it wasn't the political superpower it had once been. The Abbasid Caliphate had been weakening for centuries. During the 10th century, the Umayyad dynasty, who were Shia Muslims from Persia, effectively took control of Baghdad, reducing the Sunni Abbasid caliphs to ceremonial figureheads. Then in 1055, the Seljuk Turks took over. The caliphs were allowed to remain as religious leaders, symbols of Islamic unity, but they had no real political or military power. By the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate controlled only Baghdad and the immediate surrounding territory. It was a shadow of what it had once been. But even weakened politically, Baghdad remained immensely important symbolically. The Abbasid Caliph was still considered the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, the commander of the faithful, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Muslim rulers across the world sought the caliph's endorsement to legitimize their own rule. Having your name mentioned in Friday prayers at Baghdad's mosques was a sign of prestige and religious legitimacy. Baghdad might not have commanded armies anymore, but it commanded respect, reverence, and continued to be a beacon of Islamic civilization. And it was wealthy. Despite the political decline, trade continued to flow through Baghdad. The markets were still full, the libraries still functioned, scholars still came to study. The city had accumulated wealth over 5 centuries, and much of it was still there, stored in the caliph's treasury, in the homes of wealthy merchants, in the vaults of the city's banks. The Mongols knew this. They knew Baghdad was rich, and they wanted that wealth. So that was Baghdad in the mid-13th century, a city of perhaps 1 million people at its height, though probably closer to 500,000 or 600,000 by 1258. A city with 36 libraries, with hospitals, with public baths and running water, with markets full of goods from around the world, with scholars advancing human knowledge in every field imaginable. A city that was, despite its political weakness, still the jewel of Islamic civilization. A city that represented 500 years of accumulated knowledge, culture, and achievement. All of this is about to be destroyed, utterly and completely destroyed, in 13 days. To understand the catastrophe that was about to hit Baghdad, we need to understand who the Mongols were and how they became the most feared military force the world had ever seen. Because the Mongols didn't just conquer, they perfected conquest on a scale and with an efficiency that has never been matched. The Mongol Empire was built on 3 things: extraordinary military skill, tactical brilliance, and deliberate, calculated terror as a weapon of psychological warfare. The Mongol story begins with Genghis Khan, born Temujin probably around 1162 on the steppes of Mongolia. In 1206, after uniting the warring Mongol tribes through a combination of political alliances, military victories, and sheer force of personality, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. He then set about conquering the known world. By the time of his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, from Siberia to northern China. It was already the largest contiguous empire in history, and it was just getting started. What made the Mongols so devastatingly effective? First, they were the finest horsemen the world had ever seen. Mongols grew up on horseback. They learned to ride before they could walk. They could shoot a bow accurately while riding at full gallop. They could control their horses with their knees, leaving both hands free to use weapons. Each Mongol warrior had multiple horses, allowing them to cover vast distances at incredible speed by switching between mounts. They could travel 60 to 90 miles a day, far faster than any other army of the time. This mobility made them almost impossible to pin down or predict. Second, they were masters of psychological warfare. The Mongols had a simple policy: surrender immediately when we show up and you live. Resist and we will destroy you utterly. Not just defeat you, annihilate you. They would massacre entire populations of cities that resisted, building pyramids of skulls as warnings to the next city. They would let a few survivors escape to spread stories of Mongol atrocities, knowing that terror would spread faster than their armies. By the time Mongol forces reached the next city, the defenders would be paralyzed with fear, knowing exactly what awaited them if they resisted. Third, they were tactically brilliant. The Mongols adapted constantly, learning from every enemy they faced. When they encountered fortified cities, they recruited Chinese siege engineers who taught them how to build and operate catapults, siege towers, and other specialized equipment. When they needed to cross rivers, they forcibly conscripted local populations to build bridges. They used espionage extensively, sending merchants and traders ahead of their armies to gather intelligence on enemy strengths, weaknesses, and internal politics. They knew about rivalries, about who might betray whom, about where defenders were strongest and where they were weak. Fourth, their discipline was extraordinary. Mongol armies were organized in a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. Officers commanded their units with iron discipline. Orders were obeyed instantly and without question. If a single warrior fled, his entire unit of 10 might be executed. This created incredible unit cohesion and made Mongol armies far more coordinated than the feudal levies they typically faced, where knights did pretty much whatever they wanted and coordination was minimal. Fifth, they were phenomenally cruel in ways specifically calculated to terrorize. They would spare artisans, engineers, and craftsmen, forcibly relocating them to Mongolia to serve the empire. Everyone else, in a conquered city, might be killed. They would sometimes spare women and children, only to use them as human shields in the next battle, forcing the next city to choose between fighting through their own people or surrendering. They would catapult plague-infected corpses over city walls to spread disease. They would divert rivers to flood enemy camps, or drain them to leave cities without water. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but the conquests continued. His grandson Mongol became the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, in 1251. Mongol was ambitious. He wanted to conquer everything. He sent his brother Kublai east to finish conquering China. He sent another brother, Hulagu, west to conquer Persia, the Middle East, and ultimately Egypt. This was to be a coordinated multi-front expansion that would make the Mongol Empire truly world-spanning. Hulagu Khan was born in 1218, a grandson of Genghis Khan and a man groomed from birth for military command. In 1253, Mongol gave Hulagu a mission: conquer everything from the Oxus River to the borders of Egypt. Take Persia, take Mesopotamia, destroy the Nizari Ismailis, the so-called assassins who had terrorized the region for 150 years. Bring the Abbasid Caliph to heel. Establish Mongol rule absolutely over the heartland of the Islamic world. Hulagu gathered one of the largest Mongol armies ever assembled. By decree of the Great Khan, 1 out of every 10 fighting men in the entire Mongol Empire was assigned to Hulagu's expedition. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a proper invasion force meant to conquer and permanently occupy territory. Sources vary on the exact numbers, but Hulagu probably commanded somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 Mongol cavalry, plus tens of thousands of auxiliary troops, plus a massive siege train with Chinese engineers and equipment. This was a juggernaut. In 1256, Hulagu's forces destroyed the Nizari Ismailis, laying siege to their fortress at Alamut, in the mountains of northern Persia. The assassins had been the bogeymen of the Islamic world for over a century, an extremist sect that used targeted political assassinations to maintain power. They operated from seemingly impregnable mountain fortresses. The Mongols besieged Alamut with siege engines and catapults, pounding the fortress until the defenders surrendered. Hulagu then executed the Nizari leadership and systematically destroyed every Ismaili fortress he could find. He also destroyed their library at Alamut, which had contained invaluable historical and philosophical texts about Ismaili beliefs and practices. This was ominous foreshadowing of what was to come in Baghdad. With the assassins eliminated, Hulagu turned his attention to the big prize, Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. This was a calculated decision. Mongol Khan had specifically ordered Hulagu to bring the Abbasid Caliph under Mongol control. The Caliph represented religious authority over the Sunni Muslim world, and the Mongols understood that controlling him would give them leverage over Muslim rulers everywhere. But there was also a more practical motivation. Baghdad was insanely rich, and the Mongols wanted its wealth, Hulagu sent envoys to Baghdad demanding that the Caliph al-Mustasim, who had ruled since 1242, submit to Mongol authority. The demands were clear: send tribute to the Great Khan, provide troops to support Mongol military operations in the region, and recognize the Mongol Khan as the supreme ruler. These weren't outrageous demands by the standards of the time. Many kingdoms had submitted to the Mongols, paid tribute, provided troops, and continued to exist. It was vassalage, not annihilation. The Mongols were actually offering a path forward where Baghdad could survive, but Caliph al-Mustasim made a series of catastrophic decisions that sealed Baghdad's fate. He refused Hulagu's demands. Now, you might think this was brave or principled, standing up to the Mongol horde, but it wasn't brave, it was delusional, because al-Mustasim apparently did not understand what he was dealing with. He seems to have genuinely believed that the Mongols wouldn't dare attack Baghdad, that the Islamic world would rally to defend the Caliph, that Baghdad's walls would hold, that somehow divine intervention would save the city. He was wrong on every count. Al-Mustasim's vizier, or chief minister, was a man named Ibn al-Alqami, who was Shia in a predominantly Sunni court. Later Sunni chronicles would accuse Ibn al-Alqami of secretly corresponding with Hulagu, advising the Mongols on Baghdad's weaknesses and encouraging the Caliph not to prepare defenses. These accusations may be sectarian propaganda written after the fact to explain the disaster, or they may have some truth to them. What's certain is that the Caliph's preparations for defense were woefully inadequate. Baghdad had an army on paper of 50,000 to 100,000 men, but al-Mustasim mustered only about 20,000 troops, many of them poorly trained and equipped. He didn't strengthen the city's walls. He didn't stockpile food for a long siege. He didn't build emergency defenses. He did basically nothing. In November 1257, Hulagu's massive army began moving toward Baghdad from multiple directions. The Mongols were masters of logistics and coordination. Hulagu commanded the center, approaching through Persia via Kermanshah and Hulwan. His general Baiju commanded the right wing, approaching from the north through Mosul and crossing the Tigris River. Another general, Kitbuka, commanded the left wing, approaching from the south through Khuzestan. Plus there were forces from the Golden Horde, another branch of the Mongol Empire, supporting from other directions. The Mongols were executing a coordinated encirclement from multiple directions, a pincer movement that would trap Baghdad with no escape. On January 11, 1258, Hulagu sent one final message to al-Mustasim, offering one last chance for the Caliph to surrender and avoid destruction. Historical sources record the gist of the message. Submit now, and you will be spared. Continue to resist, and you, your family, and your city will be destroyed. Al-Mustasim's response was defiant, though sources differ on the exact wording. He apparently said something along the lines of threatening that the entire Islamic world would rally to Baghdad's defense if the Mongols dared attack. This was fantasy. No one was coming to help. The other Muslim powers were dealing with their own problems or were too afraid of the Mongols to risk confrontation. On January 17, 1258, the Mongols routed a sortie by 20,000 cavalry that al-Mustasim had sent out to try to disrupt the Mongol siege lines. The Caliph's forces were pursuing Mongol scouts, thinking they were winning, when Mongol engineers broke the dikes of the Dujail Canal and flooded the entire area. The Abbasid cavalry found themselves trapped in deep water, their horses floundering, their heavy armor dragging them down. Mongol archers picked them off systematically. It was a slaughter. Those who survived limped back to Baghdad, demoralized and defeated. This was the only meaningful resistance Baghdad would offer. By January 29, 1258, the Mongol forces had completely surrounded Baghdad on all sides. The siege engines were in position. Chinese engineers working for the Mongols had set up massive catapults and trebuchets. Date palms were cut down from surrounding groves to be used as projectiles, since there wasn't much stone in the area. Rocks were transported from places like Jalula and Jabal Hamrin to use as ammunition. The siege began in earnest. For days the pounding was relentless. Day and night stones weighing hundreds of pounds were hurled at Baghdad's walls. The sound must have been absolutely terrifying for those trapped inside. The crash of stone on stone, the rumble of collapsing sections of wall, the screams of people hit by debris. The people of Baghdad watched from their walls as this enormous army surrounded their city. They could see the siege engines being erected. They could see the supply trains stretching back for miles. They could see the disciplined formations of Mongol cavalry ready to pour through any breach in the walls. And they must have known on some level that this was hopeless. But what could they do? The Caliph had refused to surrender. They were trapped. On February 1st, 1258, after less than a week of bombardment, the eastern walls of Baghdad were breached. The Mongol siege engines had pounded a section of wall until it simply crumbled. The Ajarmi Tower, a defensive position on the eastern side, was destroyed. Mongol troops poured through the breach and began fighting on the walls themselves, clearing defenders from the ramparts. By February 4th, the Mongols controlled significant sections of the eastern wall. The siege was effectively over. The city was doomed. Now desperate beyond measure, al-Mustasim tried to negotiate. He sent envoys to Hulagu offering to submit, to provide tribute, to do whatever the Mongols wanted. But Hulagu's response was brutal and final. He had the envoys executed. There would be no negotiation. The time for that had passed. The Caliph then sent some 3,000 of Baghdad's leading citizens, nobles and wealthy merchants, hoping they could offer terms or ransom the city. Hulagu had them all killed as well. This was the Mongol way. They had offered surrender before the siege began. The offer had been refused. Now there would be only death. Al-Mustasim, realizing the end was near, tried one last desperate gamble. He offered to come out personally to surrender to Hulagu if the Mongol commander would promise to spare the civilian population. On February 10, 1258, the Caliph of Baghdad, the spiritual leader of the Sunni Islamic world, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, walked out of his city in defeat. He was brought to Hulagu's camp, where he was forced to order the remaining garrison to lay down their weapons and come out of the city. Sources describe the Caliph being kept alive for several days, forced to watch what was about to happen to his city and his people. Hulagu wanted him to witness the destruction of everything he had failed to protect. Then, after Baghdad had been thoroughly sacked, al-Mustasim was executed. The exact method of his execution is debated. Some sources claim he was rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a method the Mongols supposedly used to kill important people without shedding their blood, as spilling royal blood on the ground was considered bad luck. Other sources claim he was strangled. Either way, the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad died, and with him died the caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world for over 500 years. But before his death, al-Mustasim had to watch what happened next. For 3 days after the surrender, the Mongols didn't enter the city. They waited, they prepared, they organized. On February 13, 1258, Hulagu gave the order. The Mongol horde entered Baghdad, and what followed was one of the worst atrocities in human history, a massacre so complete, so systematic, that it defies comprehension. The Mongol forces divided into groups and fanned out through the city, going street by street, house by house, systematically killing everyone they found. Men, women, children, elderly, infants. It made no difference. They weren't looking for soldiers. They weren't looking for treasure, at least not at first. They were simply killing. The orders were clear. No one was to be spared. This was to be an object lesson to the world. This is what happens when you refuse to submit to Mongol authority. Eyewitness accounts that survived describe scenes of absolute horror. Soldiers going house to house, dragging people out into the streets, executing them. Families huddled together in their homes as they heard the Mongols getting closer, house by house, the screams getting nearer. People trying to hide in cellars, in rooftops, in wells, anywhere they might avoid detection. Most were found and killed. The streets ran with blood, literally. Multiple sources describe blood flowing in the streets like rivers after a rainstorm. The killing went on for days. How many died? We'll never know for certain. Historical sources from the time give wildly different numbers, and medieval chroniclers were prone to exaggeration when describing disasters. Some Muslim chroniclers claimed 800,000 to 2 million people were killed. These numbers are almost certainly too high, likely inflated for dramatic effect to emphasize the scale of the tragedy. Modern historians estimate that Baghdad probably had a population of around 500,000 before the siege, though it might have been as low as 200,000 or as high as 1 million, depending on which estimates you believe and how you count the suburbs and surrounding areas. Hulagu himself later reported to the Great Khan that around 200,000 people had been killed, and this is probably closer to the actual number, though still possibly an undercount. Even if we take the lowest estimate, 200,000 dead in a matter of days. That's more people than lived in any city in England at the time. That's as if the entire population of a major modern city was murdered in less than a week. To put it in perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed around 140,000 people. The massacre in Baghdad may have exceeded that, with swords and arrows, and clubbing people to death for days. There was one exception to the killing. Nestorian Christians were spared. This has to do with Hulagu's family connections. His mother, Sorgatani Beki, had been a Nestorian Christian, as was his wife Dokuz Khatun. Nestorian Christianity was common among some Mongol tribes, and Hulagu honored these family connections. Mongol soldiers went through the city marking the homes of Nestorian Christians with a cross. These households were left alone. Everyone else was fair game. This selective mercy makes the massacre even more calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a battle that got out of control. This was methodical genocide as policy. The physical destruction of the city was as complete as the human slaughter. After the initial killing was done, the Mongols turned to looting and burning. They broke into every building searching for valuables. The wealth of 500 years of accumulated treasure was hauled away. Gold, silver, gems, precious fabrics, anything of value was taken. The caliph's palace was stripped bare. The treasuries were emptied. The homes of merchants were ransacked. Artwork that had taken generations to create was destroyed or stolen. Centuries of accumulated cultural heritage simply vanished. But the worst destruction, the loss that still echoes through history, was what happened to Baghdad's libraries. The city had 36 public libraries. The House of Wisdom alone contained perhaps 400,000 manuscripts, though one scholar named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi managed to rescue about 400,000 manuscripts before the siege, taking them to Marageh in Persia. But many more remained, and the Mongols destroyed them systematically. They weren't interested in books. They couldn't read Arabic. To them, these manuscripts were just paper. The books were torn apart. The leather covers were stripped off to be made into sandals for Mongol soldiers. Think about that image. The covers of priceless manuscripts containing centuries of accumulated human knowledge being turned into shoes. The pages of countless books were thrown into the Tigris River. So many books were thrown in that historical sources tell us the Tigris River ran black from the ink. For days, the waters of the river that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 5,000 years turned black from the ink of destroyed manuscripts. Other sources add an even more horrifying detail, saying the books were so numerous that they formed a bridge across the Tigris that a horse could walk across. Whether that's literally true or hyperbole, it captures the scale of the loss. Think about what was destroyed. Mathematical treatises that we'll never read, astronomical observations that were lost forever, medical knowledge that had to be rediscovered centuries later, if it was rediscovered at all, philosophical arguments we'll never hear, poetry that's gone forever, history books describing events we now know nothing about. We're talking about the accumulated intellectual work of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, gathered over 5 centuries, representing knowledge from ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, India, China, and the Islamic world itself. Much of it was unique. These weren't copies of books that existed elsewhere. Many of these manuscripts were the only copies in existence. When they were destroyed, that knowledge simply ceased to exist. The House of Wisdom, that magnificent center of learning that had preserved and advanced human knowledge for 450 years, was burned to the ground. The astronomic observatories were destroyed. The hospitals were sacked and demolished. The schools were burned. In less than 2 weeks, the intellectual infrastructure of the most advanced civilization on Earth was obliterated. The light went out, Think about the scholars who died. We know the names of some of them from later accounts, but most are anonymous. Men who had devoted their entire lives to studying mathematics, or translating ancient texts, or making astronomical observations, or treating patients, or writing philosophy. All of that knowledge, all of that expertise, simply erased. The apprentices who would have learned from them, dead. The students who would have carried on their work, dead. The books they had written, destroyed. The research they had been conducting, abandoned forever. Entire fields of inquiry simply ended because everyone who understood them was killed. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad's infrastructure as thoroughly as they destroyed its people and its libraries. They demolished the city's aqueducts, cutting off the water supply. They destroyed the sewage systems. They tore down public buildings. They burned markets. They destroyed the irrigation canals that brought water from the Tigris to the surrounding farmlands. This last act of destruction had consequences that lasted for centuries. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, had been one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world for thousands of years, sustained by sophisticated irrigation systems that had been built and maintained over millennia. The Mongols wrecked these systems, and they were never fully rebuilt. The region went from supporting a population of hundreds of thousands to becoming much more sparsely populated. Even today, the agriculture of Iraq has never fully recovered from the destruction the Mongols wrought in 1258. After about a week of unrestricted massacre and looting, Hulagu finally called a halt. By February 20th, 1258, the killing officially stopped, not because of mercy, but because the Mongols had taken everything of value and killed everyone they were going to kill. Baghdad was a dead city. The population had been reduced by perhaps 75 to 90%. Entire districts were empty of human life. The streets were choked with corpses. The smell must have been unimaginable. Bodies lay where they had fallen, rotting in the sun. Disease followed the massacre, with so many dead bodies decomposing, with the water and sewage systems destroyed, with no one left to maintain basic sanitation. Epidemics broke out. Plague, cholera, typhus. Those few who had survived the initial massacre now faced death from disease. The population continued to decline in the months and years following the siege. It would be over a decade before anyone from Baghdad performed the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. That's how completely the city was destroyed. It took more than a decade for the survivors to reorganize society to the point where anyone could even think about making a religious pilgrimage. Hulagu didn't completely abandon Baghdad after sacking it. He installed a Mongol governor and left a garrison to control what was left. But the city never recovered its former glory. The population probably didn't exceed 100,000 or 200,000 for centuries afterward. It was no longer a center of trade. The Silk Road routes shifted to avoid the devastated city. It was no longer a center of learning. There were no scholars left. There were no libraries. There were no schools. Baghdad became a provincial backwater, a shadow of what it had been. The greatest city in the medieval world had been reduced to ruins in 13 days. The immediate strategic aftermath for the Mongols was mixed. After sacking Baghdad, Hulagu continued westward. He took Syria, sacking Aleppo and Damascus. It looked like nothing could stop the Mongol advance. Egypt was next. If the Mongols could conquer Egypt, they would control the entire Islamic heartland. But in 1260, the Mamluks of Egypt defeated a Mongol army at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine. This was the first significant defeat the Mongols had suffered in decades. It stopped their expansion south and west. The Mongols never conquered Egypt and never went further west than Syria. Part of why the Mongols didn't return in force to try again against Egypt was infighting. Möngke Khan, the great Khan who had sent Hulagu west, died in 1259. A succession crisis erupted. Hulagu's brother Kublai claimed the title of Great Khan, but other branches of the Mongol Empire disputed this. Berk Khan, who ruled the Golden Horde in Russia and who had converted to Islam, was outraged by what Hulagu had done to Baghdad. Berk declared war on Hulagu's Ilkhanate. The Mongol Empire fragmented into competing khanates that spent more time fighting each other than conquering new territory. Hulagu established the Ilkhanate, ruling Persia, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, until his death in 1265. His successors converted to Islam within a few generations, becoming patrons of Islamic culture and scholarship themselves, ironically. But the damage was done. The Islamic Golden Age was over. The great centers of learning had been destroyed or fatally weakened. The institutional support for science and scholarship that the Abbasid Caliphate had provided for centuries was gone. Now, historians debate exactly when the Islamic Golden Age ended. Some argue it continued in various forms in Persia, Egypt, and other regions until the 15th or 16th century. And there's truth to that. Scientific and cultural work did continue in the Islamic world after 1258. But there's a broad consensus that the sack of Baghdad was a catastrophic blow from which the Islamic world's intellectual leadership never fully recovered. The momentum was broken. The infrastructure was gone. The continuity of scholarship was severed. After 1258, the Islamic world never again had a city that matched Baghdad's former glory as a center of learning and innovation. Let's talk about what was lost in broader terms, because the destruction of Baghdad wasn't just about one city. It was about the trajectory of human civilization. The Islamic Golden Age had been the engine of scientific and cultural progress for the medieval world. While Europe was struggling through what we call the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was thriving, advancing, discovering, innovating. And then it stopped. Abruptly, violently, completely. Consider mathematics. Islamic mathematicians had invented algebra. They had adopted the Hindu-Arabic numeral system and spread it throughout the world. They had developed trigonometry far beyond anything the Greeks had achieved. They had worked on early forms of calculus. After 1258, mathematical progress in the Islamic world slowed dramatically. The next major mathematical advances would come in Europe during the Renaissance, and European mathematicians would build on the foundation laid by Islamic scholars. But imagine if that continuity hadn't been broken. Where might mathematics be today if the intellectual tradition of Baghdad had continued uninterrupted for another 500 years? Consider astronomy. Islamic astronomers had built observatories, created accurate star charts, developed sophisticated astronomical instruments like astrolabes, and made observations that challenged the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Some had even proposed heliocentric models. After 1258, this tradition fragmented. Some astronomical work continued in places like Samarkand under Ulu Beg, Timur's grandson, who built an important observatory in the 15th century. But the institutional support, the network of scholars, the accumulated data, so much was lost. Again, European astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo would eventually build on Islamic foundations, but the loss of continuity set progress back. Consider medicine. Islamic physicians had written encyclopedic medical texts, established hospitals, developed surgical techniques, studied anatomy, discovered new drugs and treatments. After 1258, much of this knowledge was preserved, especially in Egypt and Persia, and even in Muslim Spain before it fell. European universities would eventually translate these texts and build upon them, but countless medical texts were destroyed in Baghdad. How many treatments, how many observations, how many clinical insights were lost? We'll never know. Consider the broader cultural impact. The Islamic world had been cosmopolitan, pluralistic, tolerant of different religions and different schools of thought. Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of different ethnicities, all studying together, learning together, arguing together. After the Mongol invasions, the Islamic world became more conservative, more inward-looking, less open to foreign influence and new ideas. Some scholars argue the trauma of the Mongol invasions led to a defensiveness, a desire to preserve what remained rather than innovate, a turn toward religious orthodoxy over philosophical inquiry. This is oversimplified, and many factors contributed to these changes, but the psychological impact of such a catastrophic loss cannot be ignored. The Mongol destruction also affected the balance of power in the Islamic world. With the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed, there was no longer a central religious authority that commanded universal respect. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt claimed to establish a new caliphate in Cairo, installing a survivor of the Abbasid family as caliph. But this was largely symbolic. Real power was fragmented. The Islamic world split into competing empires, the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, various Persian dynasties, eventually the Ottomans in Anatolia and southeastern Europe, the Mughals in India. These empires achieved great things in their own right, but the unity, the sense of a shared Islamic civilization centered on Baghdad, was gone forever. There's an interesting alternate history to consider. What if Baghdad had submitted to the Mongols like so many other cities did? What if al-Mustasim had swallowed his pride, paid tribute, provided troops, and accepted Mongol suzerainty? Baghdad would have survived. The libraries would have survived. The scholars would have lived. The Mongols might have even become patrons of Baghdad's learning, as they later did with Persian culture. We know from later history that Mongol rulers could be sophisticated patrons of the arts and sciences. Kublai Khan in China became a great patron of Chinese culture. The Ilkhans in Persia eventually became patrons of Persian culture. If Baghdad had submitted, might Hulagu have become its protector rather than its destroyer? This is speculation, but it highlights how contingent history is. The decisions of one man, Caliph al-Mustasim, in a few crucial weeks in late 1257 and early 1258, determined the fate of one of the greatest cities in human history. His refusal to understand the threat he faced, his failure to prepare adequate defenses, his delusional belief that the Mongols wouldn't dare attack or that help would arrive, these failures of judgment led to catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. We should also think about what the Mongols themselves lost by destroying Baghdad, even if they didn't realize it at the time. The knowledge in those libraries could have benefited the Mongol Empire. The scholars who died could have served Mongol rulers. The architectural and engineering expertise that was lost could have built Mongol cities. The medical knowledge could have treated Mongol soldiers and civilians. By destroying Baghdad so completely, the Mongols robbed themselves and the world of incalculable treasures. They gained short-term plunder, the gold and silver and gems they hauled away, but they destroyed long-term value that could have enriched their own empire. This is the paradox of the Mongol Empire. They were capable of sophisticated governance when they chose to be. They often employed conquered peoples as administrators. They facilitated trade across their vast empire. They maintained a sophisticated postal system. They could be religiously tolerant. But they were also capable of devastation so complete that it beggars description. Baghdad wasn't the only city they destroyed. They did the same to countless others. Merv in Persia, Nishapur. The devastation they wreaked on China during their conquest of the Jin and Song dynasties killed millions. They depopulated entire regions. The death toll of the Mongol conquests is estimated at 30 to 40 million people, possibly more, making it one of the deadliest events in human history. In the specific case of Baghdad and the Islamic world, the Mongol invasion can legitimately be called a turning point. Before 1258, the Islamic world was arguably the most advanced civilization on earth, leading in science, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and culture. After 1258, that leadership gradually shifted to Europe. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, these were European phenomena built partly on Islamic foundations. But they happened in Europe, not the Islamic world. Why? There are many reasons, but one of them is surely that the Islamic world had been devastated by the Mongol invasions and never fully recovered its intellectual momentum. Think about it this way. If you were a scholar in the mid-13th century, where would you want to live? Before the Mongol invasions, the answer might well have been Baghdad or Cairo or Damascus, where scholarship was valued, where libraries were full, where you could access knowledge from around the world. After the Mongol invasions, those cities were destroyed, diminished, or under constant threat. The patronage that had supported scholars was gone. The libraries were burned, your colleagues were dead. If you were a scholar, you might look westward, toward Europe, where universities were being founded, where Latin translations of Arabic texts were creating excitement, where there was stability and patronage. The brain drain went west. This isn't to say that intellectual life in the Islamic world ceased after 1258. It didn't. Important work continued in many places. The Timurid Renaissance in Samarkand, the Safavid patronage of arts and sciences in Persia, the Ottoman support for scholarship and architecture, the Mughal achievements in India, But none of these quite matched the universal, cosmopolitan, systematic advancement of knowledge that had characterized Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age. The momentum was broken. Let's also consider the environmental and demographic catastrophe. The destruction of Iraq's irrigation systems turned productive farmland into semi-arid land that could support far fewer people. The population of Iraq didn't return to pre-Mongol levels for several centuries. Some scholars argue it didn't truly recover until the 20th century with modern irrigation techniques. That's 700 years of diminished productivity. The agricultural surplus that had supported Baghdad's large population, that had fed its scholars and artisans and merchants, was gone. Without that surplus, the region couldn't support another city on Baghdad's scale. The psychological trauma was also profound. Imagine being a survivor of the siege. You've watched your city destroyed, most of your family and friends killed, your livelihood ruined, the institutions you relied on erased. You rebuild because you must, but how do you process that trauma? What stories do you tell your children? How does that shape a culture for generations? There was a turn toward religious mysticism in parts of the Islamic world after the Mongol invasions, a seeking of spiritual solace in the face of incomprehensible disaster. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, grew significantly in influence. Some scholars see this as a response to the trauma, a turning inward when the external world had proven so hostile and violent. From a longer historical perspective, some historians argue that the Mongol destruction actually had some positive effects, controversial as that sounds. The argument goes that the Mongols, after their initial destructive phase, created a vast empire that facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia on an unprecedented scale. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, allowed for safer travel along the Silk Road. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed more freely. Marco Polo's travels to China were possible because of Mongol rule. The Mongols also, somewhat ironically, became patrons of Persian and Chinese culture in their successor states. So perhaps, the argument goes, the long-term effects weren't entirely negative. But this is cold comfort to the people of Baghdad in February 1258. They didn't know about any future Pax Mongolica. They experienced only destruction, and the loss of knowledge from Baghdad's libraries can never be recovered, regardless of what positive effects Mongol rule might have had later. The manuscripts that burned or dissolved in the Tigris River are gone forever. That knowledge is simply lost to human civilization. No amount of later patronage can bring it back. As we think about this catastrophe from our modern perspective, several lessons emerge. First, civilization is fragile. We tend to think of progress as inevitable, as a one-way street where humanity gets smarter and more sophisticated over time. But progress can be reversed. Knowledge can be lost. Entire civilizations can be destroyed. The people of Baghdad thought their city was eternal, that the caliphate would last forever. That knowledge once written down was safe. They were wrong. In 13 days, 500 years of accumulated achievement was largely erased. Second, leadership matters enormously. Caliph al-Mustasim's failures of judgment were catastrophic. If he had been more realistic about the threat, more willing to compromise, more effective at preparing defenses or negotiating, the outcome might have been very different. The decisions of individual leaders, for good or ill, can shape the fates of millions. His legacy is one of the worst disasters in human history. Third, the destruction of knowledge is one of the greatest crimes imaginable. When a library burns, when books are destroyed, we don't just lose paper and ink, we lose human achievement. The accumulated wisdom of generations, insights that took lifetimes to discover, solutions to problems that may have to be solved again from scratch if the knowledge is lost. The Mongols who threw books into the Tigris didn't understand this. To them, books were just objects made of leather and paper. But every book they destroyed was a piece of human civilization itself. Fourth, the consequences of violence ripple through history in ways we can't always predict. The Mongol sack of Baghdad didn't just affect the people who died in 1258, it affected the entire trajectory of Islamic civilization. It affected the balance of power between the Islamic world and Europe. It affected the development of science and philosophy. It affected global trade routes and demographics. That violence in 1258 has echoes that reach into our present day. The sack of Baghdad stands as one of history's great cautionary tales. It's a reminder of what can be lost when force triumphs over reason, when ignorance destroys knowledge, when short-term brutality overwhelms long-term wisdom. The Islamic Golden Age didn't have to end in 1258. It ended because one army valued plunder and conquest over everything else, and because one city's leaders failed to understand the threat until it was too late. Today, if you visit Baghdad, you can still see some remnants of its former glory. The Abbasid palace, though heavily damaged, still stands in parts. Some old sections of the city preserve the circular plan of al-Mansur's original design, but most of the medieval city is gone, destroyed either by the Mongols in 1258 or by subsequent wars and neglect. The House of Wisdom is gone. The 36 libraries are gone. The observatories are gone. The hospitals where Islamic medicine advanced are gone. What remains are memories and ruins, testament to what once was and what was lost. Baghdad recovered slowly over the centuries. The Ottomans later ruled it. It became an important city again in the Islamic world. In the modern era, it became the capital of Iraq. But it never again reached the heights it had achieved during the Islamic Golden Age. It never again was the center of human civilization, the place where the greatest minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of knowledge. That Baghdad, the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun, of the House of Wisdom and the translation movement, of mathematical innovations and astronomical discoveries, of medical advances and philosophical debates, that Baghdad was destroyed in February 1258 and never truly returned. So when we talk about the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, we're not just talking about a siege and a massacre, terrible as those were. We're talking about one of the great catastrophes in human history. We're talking about the end of an age of enlightenment. We're talking about centuries of human achievement going up in flames and sinking into the muddy waters of the Tigris River. We're talking about a turning point where the trajectory of human civilization shifted, where the center of learning and innovation moved from east to west, and where the consequences of that shift are still playing out today. The story of Baghdad's fall should humble us. It reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, no matter how much knowledge we accumulate, it can all be destroyed. It reminds us that wisdom and learning require not just creation, but also preservation, not just discovery, but also protection. It reminds us that violence, however effective in the short term, destroys value that can never be recovered. And it reminds us that the decisions we make today, about education, about preserving knowledge, about how we treat other cultures and civilizations, will echo through the centuries, just as the decisions made in 1258 still echo today. February 13th, 1258, the day the Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood, the day the Islamic Golden Age died, the day one of humanity's greatest centers of learning fell silent forever. It's a date worth remembering, if only to remind ourselves of what we stand to lose if we're not vigilant in protecting and advancing human knowledge and civilization. The books that burned in Baghdad can never be recovered. The scholars who died there can never be brought back. The knowledge that was lost is gone forever. All we can do is learn from this catastrophe, honor the memory of what was destroyed, and commit ourselves to ensuring that such a disaster never happens again. The light that went out in Baghdad in 1258 was eventually rekindled elsewhere, in other cities, in other civilizations.